being here today. And we're going to be walking, logistically, we're going to be walking from here over to the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. That's near the right flank of A and B. And you all know that it's been advertised on the internet. That's in the vicinity of the Alabama Memorial, if you're more familiar with that. And then some of you I know are parked on the other end because this information was put out in advance. And others will just walk back with me. We're going to be on the pavement the whole time, other than just stepping off here and there to get a better view. And I'm taking an approach today through the idea of the art of war and through military science. You've heard of Clausewitz in his book on war, which was translated from French into English, not in time to be taught to the Army officers that were in this battle. A third of the Army officers that fought in this battle on either side had gone to West Point. They'd studied Jomini, and Jomini's art of war was taught by Dennis Hartman. He taught logistics and tactics at West Point. And studying under him would be like studying under James McPherson or something like that. So everyone here that had studied at West Point would have been proud that they were a student of his. But Dennis Hartman taught mostly from Jomini, and Jomini taught a lot about Napoleon and the art of war from that perspective. Clausewitz starts to appear in English maybe a little bit before the Civil War, but not really hitting its stride until 1863. And then after the war, Clausewitz's book on war is quoted quite frequently. But it's of the same era as Jomini. Clausewitz is also, it has a lot of the same empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge is passed down through trial and error. And so Jomini's book is the same. He involves a lot of the principles that Napoleon would have used. We might call them Napoleon maxims. He also uses Frederick the Great's military operations to his generals. Hannibal in ancient times when he fought Scipio Africanus, and that would have been on the mainland of Italy. Battles involving Richard the Lionheart in the Middle Ages. All of those battles taught principles that were passed down, and you would learn those things if you read Jomini. And later on, Clausewitz supplanted Jomini. Now, Jomini says a number of things that are just common to military language now. I was talking to a lieutenant colonel a couple of days ago, and he said, yeah, we still use the same terminology. And Jomini used a couple of terms that I'm going to use here that are very familiar to military students. One of them is fog of war, and the other is the friction of war. So fog of war is the lack of certainty. The lack of certainty. So you and I have certainty when we look back and think about the battle. We know the outcome. So we piece everything together and we think, well, why didn't they do this and why they didn't do that? And in your own life, you can think back over circumstances on your life. If I had just done this a little different, or if I had been there a little bit earlier, or if I had, then, well, hindsight's 20/20. You look back and you can piece it together really, really clear, because the outcome is going to be a certain way that you can't foresee beforehand. At least, at the very least, it's a fog to you. You don't have clarity. There's a lack of certainty. So that's the fog of war. There's a lack of certainty, and I'm going to discuss that related to the second day of the battle on both sides. We'll emphasize the Confederates first, and then we'll shift more towards the Union emphasis a little bit later on. The other term he used besides fog of war was friction of war. Friction of war is the unexpected happenings that slow down the implementation of a battle plan. So for instance, you get up in the morning and you shower and you get ready, you get yourself a cup of coffee and you get out to the car, you're ready to pull out, you've left yourself 15 or 20 minutes leeway, extra time, and you start the car, and then you realize you left your coffee in the house and you just made it for the drive. So you think, I'm going to lose 3 or 4 minutes, but I got to go back in the house. And then the dog gets up again, and the cat gets up, and they all move around. You have to re-secure everything, get the coffee, bring it back out the car, sit down, start the car, turn on the radio, listen a little, and all of a sudden you realize I left my cell phone. So You have to get out of the car again, unbuckle, go back in the house, get your cell phone. And you come back and sit in the car, and just to add emphasis, you realize you left your glasses and you can't drive without them. And you've just now lost 15 minutes, and none of that was planned or expected. And that happens on a battlefield. There would be, for instance, if you've got 60 artillery pieces that you're pulling, and there's 6 horses a mule at least per wheeled vehicle, that's 60 times 6. That's 360 horses and mules just pulling your artillery. That's not counting all the ammunition wagons that are coming along, and all of the wagons pulling barrels of water so you can sponge the artillery between rounds. There was probably 15,000 buckets of water used on the second day of the battle just to sponge, from the creeks to sponge the artillery between rounds. So one horse loses its shoe, and all of a sudden 3 miles of wagons are stopped in the middle of the road. Well, what's the problem? So somebody has to ride forward. Well, it's a de-shoed horse. So then somebody makes a decision to put the horse out of their misery, and they finally move the vehicle over to the side, and then the other vehicles pass. None of that was planned. None of it was expected. It's called the friction of war, just like you trying to leave in the morning. So this is less of a personality-based presentation today, and it's more to do with the fog of war experienced by both sides and the friction of war experienced by both sides. So I'm going to slightly change our view here. I'm going to take a few steps over, if you would, with me, so we have a clearer view of the peach orchard. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and then elaborate on the peach orchard to get started. And that'll be part of our fog of war, friction of war discussion. Friction of war, those terms are still thrown around frequently in military circles. The staff rides that go on the battlefield use them frequently. Now, the second day of the battle, the Confederates had a secondary objective. When you're putting together a battle plan, you have primary objectives and secondary objectives. And you carefully ration out your troops to a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio when you're attacking an objective. So it's very precise. You don't want to waste reserves and have too many or too few. You want to give them a chance to succeed, so there should be at least a 2-to-1 ratio at the point of attack, and ideally a 3-to-1 ratio at the point of attack. So for General Lee, his commanding the Confederate Army, his secondary objective, which leads to your primary objective, was the peach orchard. You can see the peach orchard right over there, where the I'm presuming everybody knows the battle real well if you're on a battle walk, but occasionally there's somebody that doesn't. And it's basically the orchard that you see out there. And that's the Gettysburg Road that runs from right to left in front of it. The orchard would have extended further north along the road. It was a little bit more expansive than it is now. That's the famous peach orchard, and that was General Lee's secondary objective. He told, he said in his official report, it was the desired ground on this part of the battlefield. He never said Little Round Top was the desired ground. It was the peach orchard. Now, why was the peach orchard his secondary objective? It has something to do with his primary objective. His primary objective, what's the tactical objective? Tactical means the actual battle planning that occurs on a battlefield, unrelated to the overall operations, in some cases, sometimes directly tied. Yeah, and what's the key terrain that he wants? Yeah, Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, and that's his objective. That's his tactical objective. If he takes Cemetery Hill, what does that do? If he takes Cemetery Hill, it divides the Union Army in a retreat on 3 roads: the Emmitsburg Road, the Baltimore Pike, and the Taneytown Road. Those roads each widen and get further apart like the 3 spokes at the bottom of that wheel or top of the wheel. A Union retreat in the direction of Washington to cover Washington in the area of Pipe Creek, which was the original base of operations to cover Washington and Baltimore. Washington's 95 miles southeast in that direction, Baltimore 60 miles southeast. Lincoln's administration had told Meade, do not let the enemy interpose between you and Washington. So that means you can advance to Pennsylvania to protect Washington, But when you get that far north, 95 miles north of Washington, you leave a lot of room for your enemy to get around between you and Washington. So make sure they don't get around you and in between. If you do, the Confederates had ever gotten around and in between, the fear is that Washington, D.C. would have to be evacuated. Congress would have to leave on trains, so would all the Treasury. It would be a disaster. So you all know this is a bigger point to a broader point just to set the stage. If Meade had stayed at Pike Creek, his original defensive position, which is his water source, and then he's got a rail source there at Westminster, 24 miles south of here. Westminster, by the third day of the battle, had 4,000 tons of medical and food supplies. It was the main supply base for the fight in Gettysburg. Had Meade decided to stay there, what's to keep General Lee from not staying in Pennsylvania all summer? You have to take the offense and arrest his movements. He might stay here all summer. The election, I'll just add a little bit of politics here too. The election started in February. People live so far from courthouses that it's a long horse and carriage ride. Elections started in February and ended in November. That's why Governor Smith, that was here at Gettysburg, over on Culp's Hill, they called him Governor Smith instead of Extra Billy Smith, because it was already enough votes cast in a special election in 1863. From February to July, it was already known when he came here to fight in the battle, he was already the future elect governor of Virginia. So the election starts in February. When Lincoln spoke here 4 months after the battle, that's just 3 months until the election starts. So he has to be here too to talk to pull everyone together and assure the war could be prosecuted successfully. With the election just around the corner, starting in February, this battle in July, so it's less than a year away, Lincoln had to win Pennsylvania and New York or he had no chance of election. In my lifetime, it's been Florida, Ohio, sometimes Pennsylvania and Michigan are swing states. And you usually need to win those to win the election. And the party out of power spends 4 years trying to flip some of those back into their column. Been that way my whole life. In Lincoln's day, if you didn't win New York and Pennsylvania, you lost the election. There was no other path. So the Southerners being in Pennsylvania, taking 20,000 cows, 20,000 sheep, 30,000 hogs, 10,000 horses, thousands of pounds of flour and sugar, taking along with that thousands of 750,000 pounds daily ration of hay and oats to feed all the animals. They took over 100,000 livestock. They fed their army for 4 months. There were supply chain shortages in the South because of the naval blockade and all the battles fought across southern property where crops would ordinarily be grown. The South came into Pennsylvania a month before harvest time, not by coincidence. You let the South come up here and steal the harvest in Susquehanna Valley, and you leave them up here all summer, Lincoln's re-election is doomed. When you're desperate, you do desperate things. The Confederates rolled the dice that they could leave a golden path right into Richmond, First and Second Bull Run, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Cedar Mountain. All those battles were fought to protect, 7 days battles to protect Richmond. Now the Southerners left no protection of Richmond and marched north into Pennsylvania. They knew politically Lincoln couldn't ignore them up here all summer long. And that would draw the Union Army north out of Virginia, allow farmers in Virginia to follow in their footsteps, rebuild fences, replant food. That was the whole purpose of the timing of the Southerners advancing into Pennsylvania. So Meade had to defend Washington and cover key roads that fanned out like sun's rays from Washington and Baltimore in this direction towards south central Pennsylvania. But if he stayed in Maryland, what's to keep the Confederates from staying here all summer? Which it means Lincoln's re-election hopes are doomed. So I wanted to set the big picture there for you in case there's somebody here that didn't have that big picture knowledge. So when the Union Army transferred their defense of Washington from Maryland to Pennsylvania to pass from the defense, Pike Creek is defense, Gettysburg's offense. Okay, so just advancing to Gettysburg is offense. By advancing here into Pennsylvania, that arrested Confederate movements. The reason Buford went out towards those mountains is he knew there was only one pass through those mountains, or many passes from Virginia up through Maryland into Pennsylvania that the Southerners could cross through. Aldie, Upperburg, Middleville, and Fox and Turner Gaps, and as you move further north, Raven Rock, Fairfield Gap, Monterey Pass, Cashtown Pass. They're like highway mediums between four-lane highways going back and forth, where there's a little chain and the patrolman sits there and with his radar gun. That's kind of what the passes are through the mountains. The Confederates followed those mountains along what is today Route 11 and 81 on the west side of those mountains in the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley, using the mountains like the Great Wall of China to shield and protect their movements. They had several passes they could have crossed through, either into Maryland South or into Pennsylvania. If they wanted to cross from the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley into the Susquehanna Valley, there's only one pass that would allow them to bring 30 miles worth of wagons through, and that was the Cashtown Pass. It's straight and it's 8 miles long. So Buford would have known that would have been the only pass the Confederates would have come through. That's the Confederate escape route. Confederates would have always been nervous in their movements around south central Pennsylvania about their escape route being threatened. The reason Meade moved all the way out, the reason Lee marched all the way out to York is not only to destroy rail so the Union couldn't resupply during the battle, but it was also to advance far enough east to throw General Meade a curve and make Meade spread his army further east and keep him away from his supply line and his escape route over here where all of those wagon trains and animals were leaving. Can you see that? So like you just take here's the dog, and you don't want him there, you just throw the stick and he goes over there, and then that allows you to do whatever you want to do over here. So the movement's out towards York with Jeb Stuart and Jubal Early. It's two parts. It's logistics, rip out rail, cut the Union off from the outside world a bit, not be able to bring in emergency troops during the battle, to not be able to bring ammunition, weapons, medical supplies, horses. You cut the rail completely out by damaging the rail between here and York. But you also make General Meade have to send the 5th and 6th Corps a little bit further east than he wants to, and that keeps them away from the escape route. Buford went right to the sore spot. When he rode over towards the Cashtown Pass, and you all know he was there the day before the battle. You all knew that, didn't you? On June 30th, he was there. He saw Heath's division. They identified the flags. He knew exactly who he was up against. That was reported back to Reynolds and then back to General Meade through a representative of his. It was here at Joseph, a fellow by the name of Dickinson, who was here representing Meade. That information was passed back to Meade down in Taneytown, 14 miles south of here on the Pipe Creek line. When Buford went to Cashtown Pass, he's not just trying to gather information on how many numbers the Confederates have, what rate of speed they're moving, when do you expect them to be in Gettysburg, will they be in Gettysburg? He's not only doing all that, he's also sending a nonverbal message as Buford to the Confederates. We know the pass you came through, we know your escape route. Once that's discovered and the Union knows that, General Lee had to recall his scattered army, which was spread out over 30 miles in this area gathering supplies. Why? Because once your escape route is discovered, at any point it can be threatened. All your wagon trains can be recaptured, all the animals you've taken can be recaptured. Can everybody see that? Those are very important things. I hadn't planned to say that, but I kind of read you like you're reading me, and I look and I see whether it makes sense or not, so I add some more. So the Confederates, in one way, fought this battle. Think of somebody giving somebody a bear hug, and they just embrace them, and they hold them really tight. And that allows maybe somebody to get away. Think of the Confederate attack around the Fishhook. Defensively, think of it as a bear hug around the Union. The surrounding the Fishhook is a Confederate bear hug around the Union to allow the supplies to escape over the mountains and get back to Virginia. You ever thought of it that way? Okay, so it's mainly they're here for supplies. All right, for General Meade, as he marches north, he's using primarily 3 roads. The Emmitsburg Road, which is in view of the peach orchard there, running from right to left, and you see a pickup truck going from right to left along the Emmitsburg Road. It's one of the major lines of communication for the Union. And just beyond that last distinct tree line out there is parallel with it, with the Emmitsburg Road, roughly the Taneytown Road. It's another major road the Union Army's using. And then the third one is the Baltimore Pike, which is beyond these two roads, and they're all roughly parallel. They're the same roads that the Union Army used to pursue Lee back to the Potomac River on July 6th, up through July 13th, where there was a vote not to attack or not attack, as the last vestiges of Lee's army was retreating across Potomac. So these roads, they're not only used primarily to advance the Union Army here and all of its supplies, but it becomes the pursuit route. So these roads are incredibly important. Well, guess where those roads come together? Cemetery Hill. So people will sometimes debate who decided Cemetery Hill was the key position tactically. And some will say, well, it was Buford. He knew that on June 29th, and that's probably true. And others will say, no, it was Reynolds, but he tragically passed away on the first day of the battle, wasn't able to write his memoirs, wasn't able to speak up and explain the details of his decision making, and so he was overlooked. Buford tragically died of a sickness around Christmas time that same year, so he's not around to write a book this thick that we can go back and read and recognize him for on exactly what he was doing. And then other people will say, no, Howard was correctly recognized by Congress as the person that selected Cemetery Hill as the key position. And then others will say, no, Hancock was officially in charge around 4:15 on the first day of the battle. He's Pennsylvania's son. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania put up a monument to him on East Cemetery Hill. He deserved credit, not Howard. And it took 2 years of lobbying Congress before they finally recognized him also for determining that the Cemetery Hill was good ground. So, but the answer is none of the above chose Cemetery Hill. The answer is General Meade, when he ordered to go from defense to offense, instead of just defending Washington in Maryland, going into Pennsylvania and arresting Confederate movements, not only for political reasons, but to oust the Confederates. When Meade would have looked on a map, he would have seen that the three roads he was using to get to Pennsylvania dovetailed at Cemetery Hill. He didn't need to see Cemetery Hill to know that he needed that nexus point. Otherwise, his wagon trains couldn't unite. And so you think, well, what about those 38,000 horses and mules pulling miles of ambulances and ordnance wagons and artillery vehicles and pots and pans and axe and picks and shovels and all those logistics that the Union horses were pulling? That's not even counting the cavalry, and not even counting the Confederates. 38,000 horses and mules by conservative estimates pulling vehicles here on the Union side. You think, well, why do they have to unite at Cemetery Hill? A horse and mule pulling 1,000 pounds of ammunition can't go across a field like this. They'll end up de-shoeing the horse, or it'll break his leg. They'll have to shoot him and put him down. You can't sustain movements of ambulances, artillery pieces, ammunition wagons with 1,000 pieces of ammunition. You can't sustain any rate of speed or movement without a hard bed road. That's why the battle was fought here. There were many roads. You could put cavalry on one road, infantry on another, supply wagons on another, and they could move on parallel routes, and that avoided choke points where you have traffic jams that back up for 10, 20 miles, where one thing stops, and then there's an accordion effect where 10 miles just sit and wait for the wreckage to be cleared. So the three roads come together at Cemetery Hill. And that's sort of like the Gordian knot that ties together Union operations, so they can bring all of their wheeled vehicles and park them behind Cemetery Hill. It's a place called Powers Hill for the most part. So Cemetery Hill is key to allowing the Union Army to remain united. Let me add one other broader point, and we'll move on here, but I really wanted to say, I kind of read you, and I may have read you wrong, but I saw some eyes, and I thought, okay, I need to go back and add this. You know the concept of divide and conquer. Yeah. That's constant to every type of competition, in war, in politics, in a ball game. the first thing that you do when you're trying to defeat your enemy is you divide them first, and then you conquer. So if you divide your enemy first, then you can attack individual parts of your enemy knowing they won't unite as a whole. But you have to divide first to make sure that the part and parcel that you attack will have no help coming. Can you see that? It's really important. Think of the shock and awe in 2003 and the planes that flew over Baghdad, and we saw it on TV, all of these rockets falling at night. Remember, it lit up the sky, and we were the war in Baghdad, and dropping bombs. What was that all about? Divide and conquer. Those planes that were flying over in 2003 in the invasion into Iraq and bombing Baghdad, they were aimed at cell phone towers, television towers, radio towers, internet towers, to knock all forms of communication out. So then when daylight came up the next day, the planes then flew over and dropped leaflets from the sky. Civilians came out of their buildings, thousands, and picked up the leaflets, and it said, "Your commanders and your government have surrendered. You need to too." So nice, thousands of people, through disinformation, being divided. Right. There was no central person able to talk to them and say, "No, it's not true." Why? Because they divided them first by knocking out the communication. And that's always the case in every war. You divide first, and then you conquer one at a time, and the separate parts won't have any help coming from a united whole. So Cemetery Hill allowed the Union Army to be unified. The reason why Lee made one last desperate attempt, at least from an offensive standpoint, at Cemetery Hill on the third day, is if he took Cemetery Hill, the Union Army is no longer united. They're divided, with all the wheeled vehicles retreating on 3 roads, trying to cover Washington. 3 roads that, like bicycle spokes, get progressively further and further apart in a retreat into Maryland, and can't reunite until Pipe Creek. So you've got 12, 14 miles, and in some cases 30 miles of retreating with wheeled vehicles, where the Confederates could attack with their whole army, 1/3 of the Union Army at a time, on 3 roads separately, and overwhelming one part at a time. Divide and conquer. Does everybody see that? So Cemetery Hill is the Gordian knot that ties together all the Union wheeled vehicles. That's why there's one last desperate attempt to go at it on July 3rd. So on the second day, Lee wants the Peach Orchard, because the Peach Orchard is an artillery platform to enfilade Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. Does everybody see that? Okay. So tactically, your primary objective is Cemetery Hill. All the attacks on Culp's Hill on the other side of Gettysburg, what's their goal? To pressure Cemetery Hill from the reverse side, while Confederate attacks up the Emmitsburg Road. You always pick a point of direction that leads to your objective. Is to create pressure on Cemetery Hill from the other side and squeeze the Union line like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, and get the Union Army to retreat in that direction. Does everybody see that? All right, that's why the goal is the Peach Orchard. Now that's the logistical reason, that's the tactical reason why Lee wants the Peach Orchard. What's the logistical reason? There's an old adage, amateur study tactics, experts study logistics. And that doesn't mean anybody here is claiming to be an expert, but when you start to dabble in logistics, you start answering the why question. What's the logistical reason why Lee cost the Peach Orchard the desired ground?
They like peaches.
Hey, that's a good one. Logistical reason. Okay, where's Lee's supply line? Take a look at your map. What's his Baltimore Pike? His route that he has, what's it called?
About 30 today.
Yeah, 30. Route 30 is important. He puts his all of his wounded there. When you're retreating, when he retreated west and then turned south, they had to go through the mountains and then turn south. You always put the slowest wagons on the outside of the loop, and you put your infantry between you and your enemy's infantry. And once remove your enemy from getting to your supply wagons. Does that make sense? So the Chambersburg pike was used for the wounded to cross the mountains and then to start heading south. On the inside of them, moving with them, was all of the hogs and the cows and the sheep that would feed them for the next 4 months, and all of the miles of hay and oats. That's on the inner circle as they move west and then turn south. And then on the tightest inner circle is the infantry as a buffer between all the wagon trains. That's standard protocol. So, so logistically, Lee's Baltimore Pike, where all of his supplies are, is the Fairfield Road. So take a look there at your map. And this was a map done by Philip. This is actually done by Hal Jesperson. And it's just of the terrain and the water, all the geography. And he shows the horseshoe-shaped Union line there and how it protects the 3 roads. Now, Fairfield Road, Lee had miles of supply trains on the Fairfield Road, parked waiting to go over the mountain, and even starting to go over the mountains into the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley, from the Susquehanna Valley into the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley through the passes, and then south to Virginia. And as the battle was going on, the supplies were leaving by design. If Lee doesn't take the peach orchard, this is logistics now. If he doesn't take the peach orchard, he doesn't control the Emmitsburg Road. If he takes the peach orchard, he controls the Emmitsburg Road. That restricts Union movements down to 2 roads. Take a look at the wheel over here to your left and see all the spokes. Gettysburg's oftentimes compared to a wheel like that on the artillery piece. The hub of the wheel represents the town of Gettysburg, and all the spokes represent the roads. There were 10 major roads, counting the railroad, 11 roads. By the second day of the battle, if the Confederates take the Emmitsburg Road, and east of Gettysburg, they're threatening with the Stonewall Brigade against David Gregg on the Hanover Road. They're threatening the Hanover Road too. They've already taken the York Road. That means the Union Army has lost the Hanover Road. If they lose the Peach Orchard, they lose the Emmitsburg Road. Out of the 10 roads, how many roads do the Union have left? 2. And how many do the Confederates have? 8. So it's the roads that are determining. The hills are just window dressing on the roads. The roads are what's important. You never go in and establish a position without securing your way in and your way out. Your escape route has to be secure. So taking the Peach Orchard gives Lee an 8th road. If he takes the Hanover Road, he's got 8 roads. The Union is down to 2. That gives you a lot more mobility, doesn't it? Think of trying to exit a concert and having access to 8 roads versus 2 to get out of there. Right. So, and by Lee taking the Orchard, he's taking the Emmitsburg Road. He once removes the Union Army from reaching the Fairfield Road. If he doesn't advance, if Lee doesn't advance and take the Emmitsburg Road, the Union can go on the offensive, take this ridge, which allows them to control the Fairfield Road, and he has to leave. Lee is only one position, that's this position, away from having to retreat. If he loses this ridge, his escape route at Fairfield Road is threatened. Buford already warned him of that on June 30th just by showing up. So Fairfield Road is just right over there. That's Lee's Baltimore Pike. So attacking the Peach Orchard once removes the Union Army from being able to launch an attack here to threaten his escape route. That's the broader logistical picture. So it's not just about fruit, in an orchard, and I know you were joking. It's about a secondary position for artillery. Firing artillery from here at Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill is a lot more difficult than firing from the Peach Orchard Ridge. So if you can advance and take that ridge, you're a good half-mile closer to the Union line when you're firing your artillery. Plus you can enfilade. Enfilade means firing up the Emmitsburg Road. So those are your big picture points. And I said a little bit broader design than I planned to, but I want you to, I want to create a real strong foundation for how tactically and logistically the Peach Orchard fits into Lee's plan. So now what we're going to do is walk a little bit further south. And we may not get as far as I wanted to get, but we're going to cover a lot of good information and some really good lines of sight. We're talking about the countermarch and what's going on with that. Absolutely. And then we're going to talk about sickles and the fog of war with sickles. You're welcome. You're welcome. Absolutely. Thank you. You go ahead and take the whole stack there.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Sure.
And we got a car coming, so just be aware cars are coming from your right, occasionally illegally from your left. So fog of war and friction of war. We're talking about Claus Whitman applying his principles. On staff rides, this is the sort of thing they do, and we're attempting to do that here today. Now, we can see the Blue Ridge Mountains where the Confederates escaped with their wagon trains and their animals. It's the same mountains that they came over to advance into the Susquehanna Valley to gather supplies. And we can see the Millerstown Road over here to your right. And down below is the Eisenhower Farm off to your left here. And then that's the Plank Farm over there, the Edward Plank Farm, which is where John Bell Hood had his arm operated on the second day of the battle. It was a hospital. All along the tree line behind the Plank Barn, where you see the white silo, some of you have a line of sight to that. Behind that is called Willoughby Run Road. And that was the route that Longstreet's troops took to get here towards the end. They were following along the water routes to fill up their canteens over in this direction. They were moving from your right to left along Willoughby Run. And if you were to follow Plank Road, follow Willoughby Run out a little ways, it becomes Black Horse Tavern Road. And in a place called Brains Hill, a little bit to the northwest of here, is where later General, then Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, that's where he walked back to and saw Lafayette McLaw's division of Longstreet's Corps standing on Brains Hill, sort of scratching their head trying to figure out how they should advance to attack the Union left at the Peach Orchard. You all know about the Longstreet countermarch and what happened at Brains Hill, and Alexander called it the Troublesome Hill. But McLaws took a route that led him right into clear view of the signal station on Little Round Top. Now in those days they used high hills for signal stations. Today we would use a drone. You just fly over your opponent, take pictures. Like the Confederates used this tree line as a curtain of wood, so the Union never got a good idea of the numbers on this side of the woodlot. Nowadays you could just send a drone from the Peach Orchard or from Little Round Top and fly over, let it hover above. My son's right now doing 3D mapping in Nebraska of grain fields for the summer. It's part of his internship, and they're determining whether they need insecticides or water. Drones are just incredible when you think about being able to, you could fly over and take live footage or pictures of where your enemy is, get an exact fix of numbers, and then adjust your numbers so that you're not overwhelmed with a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio. It cleared so much up. The Union had a primitive version of a drone, and it would have been Little Round Top. They didn't have their balloons here. Does anybody know why the Union didn't bring their balloons up from Virginia? Because they had used their balloons tethered on ropes like Google Earth. They would fly up and just sort of suspend on the end of the rope, and they would send the Union Signal Corps would send a cartographer up there, and they would draw maps just like you have Google Earth now. They would look for enemy campfires 5 miles away. They could see from that balloon movements of the enemy, and they could you could see columns of dust 3, 4, 5 miles away and get a sense of how thick the cloud of dust is, how many troops were coming your way. In medieval times, you're doing history at a higher level when you use comparative methods because it shows patterns across time and space, and it also makes clear distinctions. In the Middle Ages, they used what in place of a drone or a balloon, or here at Gettysburg, Little Round Top. Towers. They used towers. You've seen towers on a medieval castle. right? It's the same sort of thing. You climb a tower and you can see an enemy campfire 5 miles away, columns of dust 3 miles away, and your enemy doesn't sneak up on you. And I'll just add this: is you were Jerry a couple minutes ago. You're talking about how I bring up unusual things. We're looking for patterns here. Why in the late Middle Ages did towers become circular instead of square? Because the square towers that are around in the early Middle Ages, you could push up a device, an engine, if you will, and it's kind of a wooden shield. And you would, if you're attacking a castle, you get really close to the tower, and then with the shield covering you with this excavation machine, you could build a fire under one corner of the tower. That robs the tower's moisture in the rocks. The rocks crumble right at a cornerstone and the square tower falls over. Also, you can easily from behind that engine or that shield that you roll up to excavate, and the Trojan horse was one of those, by the way. You roll it up and you get behind it, you're able to be shielded from arrows coming at you. It allows you to get close so you can set fires and dig tunnels under the castle and be shielded with this engine that you push forward. Well, also from behind that shield, you could throw up a ladder and scale your way over the castle walls. That's easy to do with a square tower. Late Middle Ages came the round tower. You throw a ladder against it, it won't stick, it keeps falling off. If you want to build a fire under the corner, there is no corner on a round tower. So when you go to a little round top and there's the 44th New York castle and it's round, that's late Middle Ages technology, a round tower. And what are towers used for? Like little round top, or during the battle, or a balloon before this battle, and battles in Virginia, or like, basically it's a place where you get a surveillance of your enemy miles away. So there was a scope up there and a pair of binoculars, and the signal corps was watching for anything that was approaching this part of the battlefield. And McLaws's troops came into full view on not Benner's Hill, but Brames Hill. McLaws could look over and see this big white flag on Little Round Top with a red square in the middle of it, and it was waving. If you have a flag and you're communicating, you see something on Little Round Top with your field glasses or your scope, you think you see the enemy out there, you take out your flag on Little Round Top, waggle it a couple times to the right, big white flag with a red block in the middle, and then waggle it forward. Somebody on Cemetery Hill near Meade's headquarters sees that signal. They take out a cipher disc and say, well, that's the letter H or that's the letter L. It's called semaphore communication. Today we would talk on one of these or on one of these. But back then you used nonverbal signals, flags by day or torches by night. You take out a copper shield and reflect the torches. That's how the Union communicated. And General Meade actually had part of the signal corps in the yard with his headquarters so he could get the equivalent of text messages on a regular basis. If anything was seen out there, that was the equivalent of a medieval tower, was Little Round Top, or the equivalent of a modern day drone. So McLaws could see the flags and it's, uh-oh, we're spotted. Now why is that a bad thing? As we're talking about fog of war, the uncertainties of war. Why is being spotted a bad thing? What's the worst thing about being spotted by surveillance on Little Round Top if you're McLaw's division and you have 3,500 troops? You lose element of surprise. Element of surprise is everything in war. If you can maneuver in complete disguise and attack your opponent without ever being discovered, you have 30 minutes of mayhem and chaos where you can take advantage. That window of opportunity will last 30 minutes while your enemy is trying to suddenly comprehend what's happening on their front. It's going to take your opponent 30, 45 minutes to shift troops, even with an interior line. Surprise allows you to cause the most damage. If you lose element of surprise, let's reverse this. If you lose element of surprise and you're the Confederates, then not only do you lose the ability to drive your enemy easily while they're trying to catch up to speed, but in reverse, what happens? What happens if your enemy knows roughly how many numbers you have and the rate of speed you're moving and the roads you're using? What are they going to do?
Prepare. Move troops.
Yeah, they're gonna cut you off. They might send cavalry out to cut you off, to frustrate your movements, attack you before you get here, certainly adjust the number of troops. So if the Union had an idea of how many Confederates were marching over here, your cover is blown. So everything has to be disguised. So McLaws stopped. That backed up a 3.3-mile line all the way to the Chambersburg Pike of Confederates just standing at attention in columns of 4 on a narrow road called Black Horse Tavern Road and Hare Ridge Road. From Hare Ridge Tavern all the way to not very far from where the plank farm is, to your right of it and up on the hill behind it is where McLaws was. That was the front of his column. When they were spotted, McLaws stopped dead in his tracks. And when he stopped, General Longstreet, who was operationally in command of the whole movement to attack the area of the Peach Orchard, the secondary objective, Longstreet wanted to know why things weren't moving. Why is there a traffic jam? I mean, I was on 95 the other night and everything just suddenly stopped. We pulled out our GPS and we saw a big red line. It said a 14-minute delay. And it took us forever to merge into one single lane and then past that area. And we passed the clock point and we still couldn't figure out why it slowed us all down so much. It was an accordion effect. So Longstreet was a good mile and a half behind McLaws. He was with Hood's division in front of his column, the 3,000 troops under General Hood. And Longstreet said, I better go up there and see what's going on. Why is this thing stopped? And Longstreet, as he rode forward to Breams Hill, McLaws started riding in reverse and they met somewhere in between. And McLaws said, there's something you need to see. And they got up there on Breams Hill, 3 miles west of here. They got up there on Breams Hill and Longstreet looked and he saw the flag up there, the big white flag with the little red block in the middle. That's like coming into full view of a surveillance camera in a bank or something like that. And Longstreet said, why, this won't do. In other words, the way things are going, we can't keep marching in that direction. Longstreet later said, in his book years later, he said, knowing what I know now in hindsight, and we're talking about uncertainties and not having complete knowledge, he said I would have just kept on marching even if we were seen. Because they lost at least, by conservative estimate, an hour and a half turning around to try to get into low ground again, Willoughby Run Road, without being seen by the signal station to maintain their element of surprise. What's the trade-off? Losing your surprise or losing an hour and a half turning around when you're probably already seen. So Longstreet later said we just should have just kept on going. Well, Longstreet and McLaws were talking up there for a while on Breams Hill, looking at the signal station on a little round top. And it was the guy in the 8th South Carolina standing at attention. He was an older man and he was in the ranks with Kershaw South Carolinians, just waiting, baking in the heat, 4 columns wide, filling up a 16-foot wide road called the Black Horse Tavern Road, wondering when they were going to move, and they're just standing there. And he said he could overhear McLaws and Longstreet saying things I would not want repeated in front of my grandchildren. So it was a personal conversation, but it was really intense. Samuel Johnston showed up. He had done the reconnaissance in the morning. McLaws wrote later to Samuel Johnston in the early 1890s when he was writing his manuscript. He said, I was holding a map that you supposedly wrote. In other words, it's your fault that I ended up on that hill in full view of the signal station. And the implications, he doesn't say this that I recall, but the implications are, why didn't you step in and say something? It was your map. That's what's being implied. Well, why wouldn't Johnston step in and interrupt the conversation? I know it's intense and there's probably some unsavory language going on. It's late in the day, it's hot, they're baking in the heat. But why wouldn't Johnson step in and say, hey, let me show you something. I wrote this map. You went this way and you should have gone that way. Why didn't Johnson step in and intervene and explain his map when McLaws and Longstreet were arguing? It's because he was a captain, and this is a major general. So you're waiting to be asked to speak. So he's probably hoping somebody say, Samuel Johnson, come over, would you explain this? The captain of engineers, come over and explain this. Well, he's not going to step in when he's looking at, actually, Longstreet was a lieutenant general. So you're just not going to come in and interrupt him. He just waits to let Longstreet decide whether he should come in and clarify his map or not. That's part of the fog of war. We'll be looking at the Union at the next stop, but the Confederates lost probably an hour and a half. These are conservative estimates, and the Confederate veterans labored over this after the war, because between 1884 and 1887, what is now known as Volume 3 Battles and Leaders came out originally through Century Magazine in New York, in New York City. Annals of War came out in the late 1870s, and that was in Philadelphia. So Union veterans were reading accounts written. It was very popular. There's a lot of nostalgia to remember the war 15, 20 years later. So the veterans were writing to major publications, and there was an appetite for people who were buying subscriptions to their normal Sunday paper to have included with it a general's article that was being featured. And as the Union officers began to write post-war accounts, it became clear to Confederates who got copies of these New York and Philadelphia publications written by Union officers. It became apparent in reading them that Little Round Top was only occupied 10 minutes before the Alabamians attacked there. So the Confederates obsessed after the war. They had nothing better to do. They obsessed over, well, certainly Longstreet could have saved 10 minutes somewhere back here, and then Round Top would have been unoccupied, or at least some portion of the Union line would have been less ready. And Longstreet later wrote in his book, he says, I should have just told McLaws, keep going. You know, it's not worth backtracking. There's more we can say about that, but that's part of the fog of war and the U.S. Marine Corps came here in 1923. You all know that. They reenacted Pickett's Charge in their World War I gear. President Harding watched Pickett's Charge reenacted by World War I soldiers in 1923 from a tower that used to stand where the old Cyclorama building used to be in Ziegler's Grove. And there was a plane that crashed. If you go behind the American Heritage Museum, there's a plaque back there where the plane crashed. It was a World War I prop plane used in the reenactment for President Harding, and it crashed there and killed the pilot. Well, that reenactment also featured the Marines, World War I Marines, reenacting Longstreet's countermarch to see if they could get here quicker than Longstreet did, and they couldn't. They couldn't, but that many years later, the veterans were still arguing about it. They were still arguing about it in 1923, about the fog of war back there on Brames Hill. Yes?
I might have missed this, but why didn't they bring the balloons?
Yeah, I was gonna
Oh,
say
yes, thank you for that. What was torn out, 100 miles of was torn out? Rail. The Confederates ripped out 100 miles of rail. Now, that doesn't mean continuously every single mile of track. It means like you're going down the highway or Route 76 and there's a pothole and you hit it and it jars your jaw and maybe hurts your teeth and you got a headache for an hour and have to get your tires rebalanced. If you've ever had that instance, if PennDOT doesn't come out and fill in those potholes, those roads can deteriorate pretty quick, right? Okay, think of the railroad tracks as the Confederates would ride along 5 miles and then they would create the equivalent of a pothole there in the track. They would take out 4 ties, set a fire, put the rails on in that section that they ripped out until the rails were blistering hot and they were moldable, and they would bend them like Sherman's neckties long before Sherman did it, and then just toss the bent rails in the woods so if a train went along full speed, they're suddenly or derailed. The Confederates did that to 100 miles of rails. And I hadn't planned to say this, but I'm going to say this here because I'm looking around and trying to read you here, and I'll see how quick I can say it. It's so important to understand that the Confederates ripped out 100 miles of rail, or damaged 100 miles of rail on 4 different railroad companies, not because of anger management problems, but because they wanted to knock out the rails and the telegraphs so the Union couldn't resupply if the battle took place here. So it's not a coincidence that those rail lines were ripped out. They targeted those rails on purpose. I'll give you another example. Why didn't Lee have other cavalry here to replace Stuart? Robertson's cavalry. People will say Lee had cavalry. Where was Robertson's cavalry? Which would have helped Lee have the equivalent of Buford since Stuart was not here. Where was Robertson? He was tearing out the Baltimore and Ohio rail line from Harper's Ferry to Frederick. Why is that? So the Union Army couldn't use the line from Frederick to Harper's Ferry to cut off Lee's retreat. That's why Lee got away. He ripped out that rail in advance so there could never be an advance behind his lines during the battle. Why didn't the thousands of Union troops race for the defense of the state that were in Harrisburg and from the Ohio Valley all around Harrisburg? Why did they not arrive here until the battle was over? Because Lee ripped out the Cumberland line on the other side of those mountains. Pickett's division was ripping out rail line in the days before the battle west of those mountains that lead towards Harrisburg. That's why extra Union troops never arrived during the battle. That's why extra ammunition didn't arrive. That's why extra rifles didn't arrive. That's why extra troops didn't arrive. That's why extra horses didn't arrive. It's because he ripped out the rail. And that's critical. It's critical to know that. Why did Lee attack Culp's Hill logistically? Forget the tactics. The tactics is to reach Cemetery Hill to create a pincer on Cemetery Hill in conjunction with attacks up the Emmitsburg Road. But logistically, why did Lee attack Culp's Hill for 2 days? To step on the scab, that is the damaged rail between Gettysburg, Hanover, and York, so the Union Army couldn't have a rail connection to the battlefield. And he stayed there until he fought 3 days. Why do you fight 3 days? Lee probably lost the battle on the 2nd day. Why did he fight a 3rd day? He fought a 3rd day because armies carry 3 days rations on them. And they keep supply wagons that are close to them. They try to minimize the number of wagons on a field so it doesn't clog accesses to the front lines and ambulances going in and out, movements of troops. So armies keep 3 days rations. If you fought a 2-day battle and it looks like you've lost, you have to fight a 3rd day to make the Union use up their 3rd day's rations. So when you start your retreat, you've already ripped out the rail, and it's going to be 48 hours before the Union Army can resupply. That gives you a 48-hour start. That's how Lee escaped. So that's logistics. So as long as Lee's troops were attacking Culp's Hill, they were once removing the Union Army from getting to the Hanover Road and getting to the Hanover-Gettysburg line that goes all the way to York. Can you see that? The Union Army was not fully operational as long as they didn't have the rail line fixed. It's like, let's say you good folks invited me and my wife over for dinner, and the night before you wrote me and said an email and said, I'm so sorry, but we're not fully operational. You know, we have septic, water, and electricity normally. We have septic and water, but we don't have electricity. Well, my wife and I will still come over. You can use candles. No, I'd rather you wait till next week. You're not fully operational. Your refrigerator's not working. You had to bring in some ice and put your food in there. You're not operational as long as the electricity's down. Same is true if the septic is down or if the water's down. You can function, but you're not fully operational. The Union Army was not fully operational here at Gettysburg because to be fully operational, you have to have water, rail, and road. The Union Army had water hookup at Rock Creek for all their animals. Where the horse or mule drinks 12 to 15 gallons of water a day. You got 38,000 horses and mules pulling wheeled vehicles. You've got roads. You're only down to 2 if you lose the peach orchard. And railroad. The Confederates took that away. So the whole battle, the Union Army was fighting. That's why General Meade made a comment of, someone said he made a comment of, in so many words, this is not a perfect position. As long as the Confederates had that rail blocked off. And did you know that there were people trying to repair the rail during the battle? 200 African Americans and 200 Irish were repairing the rail, and they got within 3 miles of the battlefield. But they couldn't complete it as long as the Confederates were east of Gettysburg. That's why Lee left them over there. Okay, so that's planned to say that, but I want you to see operationally, there's a whole lot more going on than taking a hill. Okay, so let's walk down the road a little bit. Again, we may not get as far as I wanted to, but hey, that'll be okay too. About the balloons, yes, the ripping out of the rail line prevented the balloons from being here. They're very clumsy. Hydrogen balloons are very clumsy. That's like your GPS being out in your car.
No cell service.
Yeah, no cell service. Dead spaces where you have no signal. On the battlefield, there are dead spaces where your enemy's out of your view. And you don't have a device to be able to know exactly where they are. Now, and that's dangerous because they have ill will towards you, and you can't let them get close without putting up all kinds of buttresses between you and them. Now, so generally, once the peach orchard, and I'm going to say something here now about the scouting mission in the morning by the Confederates. Samuel Johnston came out between sunup, about 4:15 a.m., and probably as late as 6:30, he was on a reconnaissance ride from Brames Hill, and rode and took roads, and also stayed in cover of woodlots so he wouldn't be spotted. He had 3 or 4 people with him, accompanying him, to try to determine the routes for the infantry and for the artillery vehicles to take to get into position to make this attack. It's like you planning for a vacation and choosing the best roads to take. And when you're pulling a lot of wagons, you have to be real careful to choose the right roads. So he was doing what the military would call a route reconnaissance. Route means determining what routes the infantry should take, what routes the ammunition train should take, and the artillery should take. But it was also an area reconnaissance. Area means you're looking for anything pertaining to the importance of the attack. So that means you want to find your enemy's position, exactly where it is, how many troops are there if you can. You're going to find out as much as you can. Some information is better than no information. You also, as you're maneuvering into position, you also want to find an artillery position to attack from. So one of the artillery battery commanders in Alexander's battalion accompanied Samuel Johnston, along with a fellow by the name of Clark, who was representing Longstreet. So we know Clark was on the scouting mission, Johnston, and a battery commander. A battery is 4 artillery pieces in the Confederate battalion. It would be four guns is what's called a battery on the Confederate side. So Johnston himself also understood artillery. He was an engineer. Some of you knew in 1864, he helped with the reconstruction of a rail line running through Georgia. And he was particularly good at determining the height and the grade, because steam trains can't go up real steep slopes. They can't generate that kind of power. And they also have to be along water stations, because everything was water powered back then. So that's why you have to have water, rail, and road. If water and road and rail all intersect, the horses have to have it as well. But so do the trains. The trains depended on steam. Civil War is the first modern war which is largely based on steam. There's also photography, and there's telegraph. Later in the century, you have the Second Industrial Revolution. That involves combustible engines. electric grids. Orville and Wilbur Wright are flying by 1903. Photography advances. X-ray machines are invented. Phonographs are invented by Edison. Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. Tesla puts in place the design for radios by the 1920s. All this happens in about 120 years, and it was a volatile thing. World War I and II are tied into that quick expansion in technology. But water is critical for steam trains. So back to Samuel Johnston, he knew how to lay a track and make sure that the train was on a level surface. He chose the country that it should go through, the best routes in relation to water, to have water stations. So this is a really good engineer. Engineers measure twice and cut once, if you ever know an engineer. Very meticulous people. They don't do things by the fly. They do things very meticulously. So Samuel Johnston, did you know he placed the artillery guns on Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg? You know, and you can say, well, anyone could have chosen that position for artillery, I suppose, but it's still him that chose that position, and along with Alexander, who placed the gun specifically, it was Samuel Johnston who chose that artillery position. He did that also at Gaines' Mill, which was one of the 7 Days battles. So when he came over here, what was Samuel Johnston looking for? He was looking for the best place to post these artillery to attack the secondary objective of the peach orchard, so that Confederate attacks could guide up the Emmitsburg Road, where you see the motorcycles coming down the hill. That's the Emmitsburg Road. There, in those woods off to your left, those are Seminary Ridge woods off to your left. Anderson's division was there. So there's about 5,000 Confederates in those woods, waiting for Longstreet to appear on the Emmitsburg Road, perpendicular to it, that is, form a T. And the Confederates had to attack up the Emmitsburg Road, not only to reach Cemetery Hill, but to reconnect with the remainder of the Confederate Army closer to Cemetery Hill, specifically the woods that you see straight ahead. An army is never more in jeopardy than when it's detached. Divide and conquer. Go back to that principle. When Lee had his heart attack at Chancellorsville, it was probably not directly related to Stonewall's wounding. His heart attack came from his army. He had split his army and attacked from widely separated points. If you're going to do that, you have to come together with your separated wings before dark. If your army's separated, divided, and it's dark, and you didn't bring them together on a bullseye point, then under the cover of darkness, you don't know what will happen. 6, 7 hours later, you wake up at dawn and you may be surrounded. One half of your army's surrounded. A lot of bad things can happen to you under the cover of darkness. As a rule, you don't separate your wings unless you can bring them together before dark. Does that make sense? And if you're detached, let's say Longstreet's corps represented 1/3, we talked about friction and fog of wars, Longstreet's corps represented 1/3 of Lee's army. While they were marching through the back country, I'm sure Lee's heart was palpitating again. Probably all kinds of gurgling in his lungs, and probably from fluids from his heart not working well from the recent heart attack 2 months earlier. Why? Because Longstreet's marching through the back country detached from the majority of the Confederate Army. How do you reattach? Find the peach orchard, attack up the Emmitsburg Road in that direction, and you're going to create critical mass by joining the rest of the Confederate Army closer to Cemetery Hill. Does everybody see that? That's why Longstreet can't maneuver forever by himself. And why is it so stressful until Longstreet actually attaches by attacking up the Emmitsburg Road? It's so stressful for Lee because his army can be attacked, the 2/3 of his army, which are north of here, can be attacked while 1/3 is missing. So he's weaker. His whole flank could be turned. Did you all know that General Meade said under sworn testimony before Congress in March of 1864 in the basement of the Capitol before a bipartisan committee who investigated the particulars of the battle? Did you know that between noon on the second day of the battle and about 1:30 he planned an offensive attack over here to threaten the Fairfield Road? Did you all know that? When Sickles moved out, he wasn't the first to think of that. Meade was already over here an hour and a half planning that. No one's ever called Meade a liar. No one. Even his enemies never said that he lied. And Meade, under sworn testimony before Congress, said that he planned that attack. It was to involve part of the 5th and 6th Corps and 3rd Corps. 5th and 3rd would advance to the orchard, and then they would attack here. As long as the Confederates had no presence here, because Longstreet hadn't appeared, you can turn Lee's flank here and then threaten the Fairfield Road. Maybe he retreats at that point. He's got to cover his supply lines. Longstreet's unaccounted for, so if you're in Meade's fog of war, Lee is really vulnerable. When Longstreet's, it's not that he's just losing time. Every moment that he's separated from the Confederate Army, they're vulnerable, and they're down by 1/3 their forces. Can you see that? So Lee showed up over here on this ridge, and closer to where the amphitheater is, not far from where you're parked. And Walter Taylor saw him there. He's one of Lee's staff, and Lee asked about where Longstreet was, and then Lee retraced these back roads towards the Plank Farm that I pointed out to you, where Hood had an operation on his arm, and found his way to Willoughby Run. He found Longstreet's columns. And it would have been in the time when they were turning around, because they had to turn around not to be seen by the signal station. So Lee was checking up on this, not because he was trying to reprimand anyone, but he must have felt a knot in his throat, because Meade could attack at any moment. And by the way, just to really turn you upside down, I only do this on battle walks. I wouldn't do this with a regular group because they wouldn't have the frame of reference. That's why I look so forward to the battle walks, as a frame of reference so you could talk nuanced, and many of you get it. How many of you know that General Meade ordered premonitory orders, no discussion, premonitory orders? In other words, you're court-martialed if you don't follow these orders. That he gave orders at 10 a.m. for General Slocum to take the 5th and 12th Corps to attack the Confederates on Benner's Hill on the Union right. How many of you know that? And then Slocum didn't respond until 11 a.m. And what would have happened had that? Why did Meade want to make an attack? Take a look at your map. I want you to see what's going on. It's all part of the fog of war. You think, well, he's on the Union left. Well, it's all tied together. All of it's related. Look on your map and notice on the upper right-hand corner the Hanover-Gettysburg Railroad. Can you see that up there? Can you see the Confederates? The Confederates were between York Pike and Hanover Road, pressuring the Culp's Hill area so the Union couldn't extend their line up to the Gettysburg-Hanover rail line and be fully operational. Think of the Union fishhook as a paper clip. And imagine taking the paper clip and unbending it and making it straight. That's what Meade wanted to do. He wanted his line straight. He wanted to put space between all of his supplies on the Baltimore Pike and put space between the Confederates and the railroad, which was being repaired. So he ordered an attack with parts of 2 corps to be supported by the 6th Corps when it was within the supporting distance on his right. Why would he want to attack Benner's Hill? Think logistically. I sort of subliminally put it in there for you. Yeah, if you attack Benner's Hill, you remove Confederate presence east of town, you reclaim the Hanover Road, you reclaim the York Road, and you reclaim the Hanover-Gettysburg Railroad. And you pin Lee's back to the mountains. So the next move can be threatening his escape route either on the Cashtown Road or the Fairfield Road. Now both armies have 5 roads each. And just food for thought. Every once in a while I'll say something that's a zinger. Get ready for this. Really think through it. I hope you never let go of this. Just keep thinking on it until it really, really works into you. Had Slocum made the attack, would the Confederates ever, had he made the attack and it been successful, would there ever have been a Confederate attack on Culp's Hill? No. Would there have ever been a Confederate attack on East Cemetery Hill? No. Would there have ever been fighting on Brinkerhoff Ridge? Would there have ever been a battle at East Cavalry Field? No, because Confederate presence would have been removed east of town. That was the whole point of the attack. And here's the real zinger. Had Slocum made the attack and obeyed orders and made the attack and had been successful, had he made that attack, would the attack against the peach orchard, the wheat field, and the round tops ever occur? No, because General Lee, until Longstreet got in place, General Lee only had one division in reserve. Reserve means troops you can use in a pinch. And what division was that? They're in that clump of woods over to your left. Richard Anderson's division. 5,000 strong. That's his only reserves. Where do they have to go if Slocum makes the attack on Benner's Hill? They have to go over to Benner's Hill because Johnson's division is only 5,000 strong. Meade's attack involved parts of 3 corps. He's going to have a 3-to-1 advantage. The only way that Johnson doesn't get eliminated east of Gettysburg is if Anderson goes over. If Anderson's 5,000 troops leave this wood line and go over to defend against Slocum's attack, does Longstreet ever attack up the Emmitsburg Road? No, because there's no one to attack towards. There's no troops on your left to try to reattach to. Is it a coincidence that Slocum is out of this army the remainder of the war after this battle? Okay? The biggest what if of this battle, in fact, the biggest cover-up of the war is that Slocum didn't make that attack. The rail lines would have been repaired. Thousands of Union troops would start arriving from the Ohio Valley, ammunition, horses, medical supplies, and General Lee would have had nowhere to go but back over the mountains. That was on July 2nd. Slocum didn't answer. He answered to the 9:30 message. The 9:30 message was, Meade wrote to him, I want you to look into the practicability of making an attack with the 12th, 5th, and the 6th Corps once they're within supporting distance. That was at 9:30. At 10 o'clock, Meade wrote a follow-up when he didn't hear from Slocum, and it was a peremptory order. This is what you're going to do. Okay, the discussions are over. Slocum wrote back before 11. Meade received it at 11, and it was Slocum wrote to the first message when it was an if practicable order, and he wrote back and said it's not practicable to make that attack. And he goes on and talks about how he would be detached east of Gettysburg, and we're not saying that he was wrong or that he didn't have good points. The point is that he didn't make the attack, and it had a ripple effect across the whole battlefield. There's probably people say, well, he would have lost several thousand lives there, wounded and killed. And my son's 21, and those are precious lives. Every life is precious, and losing one life is too many. If we're going to weigh, though, how many lives were lost, the attacks on the second day led to 18,000 casualties on both sides. Maybe you have a fraction of that if Slocum makes the attack. All of the lives that are lost over here fighting in the wheat field, none of that happens if Slocum obeys those orders. So that's all part of the fog of war. Slocum decides to not make the attack. All right, I'm going to make one more stop. We'll walk up to the Slider Farm, and that's where we'll end. I'll bring together some conclusion thoughts from there, and then we'll just start walking back. That'll get us back in plenty of time. Point. Remember we said Longstreet, as long as Longstreet was detached, Lee was having heart trouble again because 1/3 of his army is marching through the backcountry. That means he only has 2/3 of his army to receive an attack if Meade decides to attack. You and I say, well, we know Meade didn't attack. Well, that's the fog of war. We don't know that. And in fact, he ordered it to happen, and it didn't happen. So Lee would have known that he was very, very dangerous situation when you detach 1/3 of your army and send them on a secret march. It means you're vulnerable to be attacked with only 2/3 of your army on the front lines. And then there are 2 ways to bring detached forces together. What are the 2 ways to bring, if you detach 1/3 of your army, how do you reattach? There's 2 different ways to reattach. Because you don't want your army spread out. Somebody can divide and conquer. They can attack you part and parcel. Ambush 1/3. That's why you don't want. That's why Lee's army quickly concentrated using the roads of Gettysburg, concentrating on the hubs so they wouldn't be divided. And that's why Lee's troops marched out towards York, not only to rip out rail, but also to draw the Union Army out towards York and away from his supplies, and to divide the Union Army so you could attack them on separate roads. Everybody got that? You divide and conquer. That's always the rule of thumb in any form of... So how do you bring a detached force into reattachment? 1/3 of an army, 13,000 troops detached in the case of Longstreet. All right, one way is to attack from widely separated points, choose a bullseye that the two attacks are supposed to meet. Widely separated wings attacking towards one point where they gain critical mass as they get closer and closer together, that's riskier, but that makes the defender spread their forces out, meaning that if the defender overcommits in either direction, then the other direction is broken through. It puts a lot of pressure on the defender to have to defend in two directions, and it increases the chance they'll make a mistake. So there's a whole lot greater gain can be made by attacking from widely separated rings, but you better come together before it gets dark, because some very ugly things can happen in the cover of darkness. You wake up the next morning, you might be surrounded by your entire enemy, and you only are one half. So the other way that you bring 1/3 of your army back into connection with the other 2/3, or 1/2 in connection with the other half, is what? Just have a march on their flank and just connect before you attack. So that brings up the question, when Pickett's troops attacked, were they guiding on the copse of trees to bring them together so they all could be together, Pickett on one side, Pettigrew and Trimble on the other, or were they attacking as separated wings? Pettigrew first to draw the Union line and resect it north to Ziegler's Grove, and then Pickett was trying to flank them, and the two would come together at Ziegler's Grove. Were they guiding on the copse of trees? They never said anything about the trees. So I rather think they were attacking in two separate parts to get the Union Army to overcommit in the wrong direction. Yes?
So if you're going to converge your flanks,
Yes.
that means that either the middle has to slow down,
Yeah.
or they have to speed up, right?
The middle?
If they keep the same speed,
Yes.
the same rate of advance, then they're not going to come together.
Yes, and so that's a great point. Yeah, that's why you're told to look for an opportunity on your front and demonstrate until you can turn that into a real attack. If one side of a wing attack and a two-wing attack is successful and starts to break through, the defender's going to shift troops disproportionately to that threatened area, which the other wing will start to notice troops leaving on their front. How do you notice troops leaving on your front? Skirmishers. They didn't have drones back then, and their balloons and/or a hill-like little round top can't look over a tree line like this and look straight down and take pictures like a drone could. But you still can find out how many troops are in front of you through skirmishers. How would you do that? It's like today, if an archaeologist goes into an ancient Roman forum, one of those amphitheaters, or ancient Greek amphitheater, they count the seats in the amphitheater, the stone seats, and then times that by 10, and that tells the archaeologist how many people lived in that polis or that city at the time. In a similar way, you send skirmishers out into no man land because you know your opponent's going to send out skirmishers too, because they're not going to want you to get very close and see what they're masking. Well, if you're out on the skirmish line, you get used to how many skirmishers are firing at you. You do quick math. If you discover there are 300 skirmishers, you're on the skirmish line with 300, and your enemy has about 300 skirmishers too. If a skirmish line is 1/10 of the main line, how many troops are those 300 skirmishers of your enemy covering? 3,000 times 10. So General Lee would have known from skirmishing out here in no man's land that there were about 4,000 Union troops on the other side of the Peach Orchard. He didn't have to have a drone fly over and take a picture. He sent out Wilcox's Alabamians. He sent out Lane's North Carolinians. They skirmished with the 3rd Maine, the 5th New Jersey, and the U.S. sharpshooters. And they both gauged the strength that the other was concealing, either the Confederates behind these woods or the Union behind the Peach Orchard. So that's how they were. That's Of course, Sickles was getting really upset and worried because the skirmishing was continuing here. Now I'm talking fog of war. I'm going to be doing this again on July 2nd for the anniversary, so this is sort of my practice. I'll sit down later today and tomorrow and I'll think, all right, cut this, shorten that, add, why didn't you talk about this, that, and the other? If you come out on the 2nd, it'll look very different. I may even get further. Right now I'm working through it all on my feet, and I thank you all for helping me do that. But let me throw this at you. When McLaws turned around to march back, so he wouldn't be seen by the signal station, do you know how far he marched back? He marched back all the way to Hare Ridge Road. That's almost near Hare Ridge Tavern, right at the intersection of Old Mill Road and Hare Ridge Tavern. Now, Harry Fonz, who I look up to greatly and has been very good to me, and to me he's a hero of mine. Years ago when he put together his second day book, he met with Bob Crick, who was then the chief historian at Fredericksburg, and they went out and looked at the countermarch before Harry Fonz's excellent book on the second day was published. Before they went to publication, before Fonz went to publication, he wanted to get an idea of how far McLaws' division turned around and marched back to not be seen by the signal station before they then got into low ground on Willoughby Run Road, came out where you saw the plank farm where Hood's arm was operated on, and then came up the Millerstown Road and came up behind these woods until they were ready to attack. Before that turnaround, or after that turnaround, Fonz finally decided he went with Occam's razor. What's Occam's razor? What's the most simple explanation? All right, and some of you, how many of you have done the countermarch with me before? I've done it a number of times. I haven't done it in years, and we've gone out and walked through there and had to get permission to walk on private property. But Fonz went with Occam's razor before he went to publication. He said the most likely scenario is that McLaws marched to the Mark Forney farm. If you know that area on Black Horse Tavern Road, the McClellan Cemetery is there too. And he turned there in this direction to access the Fairfield Road to the Willoughby Run Road, for those of you that know the story real well. Today there's power lines that run along his Occam razor explanation. Power lines, and the grass is cut to clear for the cables and for cell phone towers. And so that's what we normally say. The turn was between Mark Forney Farm and the Adam Butt Farm, and then came out on the Fairfield Road. There's a pizza place there today, and there's also a housing development on the Fairfield Road. So that's what we normally go with. That's Occam's razor. That's the most logical way for McLaws to save time and getting over here and not be seen by the signal station. However, if you read the Confederate accounts, none of the Confederate accounts say that Longstreet, that is McLaws' division, half of Longstreet's corps at that point, turned where those high power lines are between Mark Forney and Adam Butt Farm. The Occam's razor perspective. The Confederate accounts don't say that. They actually say that McLaws marched all the way back to the intersection of Old Mill Road and Hare Ridge Road. That's another good mile north. Way out of the way. I mean, that would cause you to lose an extra hour. Why would they do that? And Fonz concluded that they didn't, and that somebody wrote the account wrong, and that they actually would have taken more logically this high power line connection between the Forney farm, where the power lines are today, between Forney and Adam Butt. However, the Confederate accounts say they marched all the way back to Old Mill. Now, why would they do that? Watch this, fog of war. Guess who saw that? Guess who saw all of those Confederates at the intersection of Old Mill Road and Hare Ridge Road? Little Round Top. It's in the ORs, the official records. Volume 3. This would actually be Part 3. It's Volume 27, Part 3. And in the time sequence, July 2nd, at 1:40 p.m. on July 2nd, a signal officer up there, using his, we would say, binoculars and his tripod scope, spotted McLaws' division marching that way. Took out his flag, did the Signal Corps, started waving it to General Meade's headquarters. You can see Cemetery Hill, the primary tactical objective. General Meade's headquarters, by the way, if you want to know what the key position is on any battlefield, find where the general's headquarters are. There, that's right. Look at General Lee's headquarters. Where is it? Facing Cemetery Hill, right? And where is General Meade's headquarters? Behind Cemetery Hill, just a stone's throw from where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Why? Because you always want to be at the decisive point on the battlefield in case it's ever jeopardized. So the signal flags on a little round top signal to General Meade's headquarters. He actually had somebody observing right there from his yard, just like me receiving a text number message. And the signal flag said, 10,000 of the enemy are moving from our left to our extreme right. That's volume 27, part 3 of the ORs, the official records, declassified in the late 1880s, published in 1889 for the veterans to be able to write their memoirs. Then the next message was at 2:10 p.m., a half hour later. The follow-up message is, they have their ambulances with them. Now, all right, what does that mean?
Means they're going to attack.
That means they're going to attack. You don't bring ambulances unless you think there's going to be an attack. And they're headed from our left to our extreme right. We're talking about fog of war now. You and I say, well, I know where the attack's going to be, so we don't have any confusion. But if you're General Meade, you're planning an attack right here to take this ridge and threaten the Fairfield Road, and also once remove the enemy from gaining another road, the Emmitsburg Road. And you're in the midst of planning that, and the signal station receives a message that's relayed to you in the field that the enemy, the attack you've been looking for all day, there's been no record of where Longstreet's corps is through any sightings or any intel behind the scenes where a farmer comes into the lines and you pay him money to give you information of where bodies of Confederate troops are. There's no information of where 1/3 of Lee's army is. That's Longstreet's corps, because they're the right hook that's supposed to come in at some point and attack over here. You're Meade. You don't know when this attack's going to come. Now let me add a little bit of confusion, more confusion. Did General Lee, for those of you who know the whole... Now, so having McLaws march an extra mile and lose time actually causes Meade to go over to his right because he's worried about the rail line over there. He's worried about the Baltimore Pike, 38,000 horses and mules pulling miles of ambulances, ordnance wagons, artillery pieces. They're all near the Baltimore Pike. All of that's accessible east of town as long as the enemy is also sitting on your water supply. They're picking at the scab of your rail that you're trying to repair. And at the same time, they're threatening all your wagon trains on the Baltimore Pike. That's where Meade's worried his right flank. And so he goes over to the right, and Sickles decides to move out and complete what Meade had started. And he advances out to this orchard. He's not going to give up this road. And Meade did not know that Sickles went ahead and advanced out. Now, Meade, I'll just add this too, and we'll wrap it up here because I'm looking at the clock now. I'll just add one more thought process here for you. Why was Sickles ordered not to come out here? Or why would Meade later on say that he advanced too far? If Meade himself was over here planning an offensive attack to threaten the Fairfield Road. He said that under sworn testimony before Congress, that he was contemplating an attack with parts of 3 corps before the signal station, we'll add, sending back to the right. That's why the Battle of Hunterstown took place north of town. Look at your map, you'll see Hunterstown. You know why the battle took place at Hunterstown? Because Union cavalry went up there to scout the area to see if Longstreet's corps was headed to the right flank like the signal station had warned. So Heidlersburg and Hunterstown north of Gettysburg were scoured by Judson Kilpatrick's cavalry, including Custer's Michigan Brigade, because they were looking for Confederate infantry that had been spotted at the Dr. Hall house near Hare Tavern, headed to the right. And the only roads to get from the Union left to the extreme right was through Hunterstown. It's called Shriver's Corner Road. That's why the cavalry battle occurred there. It just so happened there was Confederate cavalry under Wade Hampton coming through, unrelated to infantry. That's why there was new Union cavalry down here. Because they were responding to an alarm from Little Round Top that sent them to Hunterstown. Can you see how? See, I'm trying to talk about the fog of war, and I'm working all that out and the uncertainty. You and I know how this thing works out. They didn't know that at the time. So General Lee's attack then, when it does take place, General Sickles has already moved out. Oh, this is what I was going to add as maybe another zinger. The reason why Sickles, after Meade leaves here and goes to his right and thinks the attack's going to be there, that answers the question for us. Why doesn't Meade want Sickles to move out to the orchard? Even though he had thought about it earlier himself, why after 2:10 p.m. is he no longer allowing Sickles to move out to the orchard?
Because the Confederates wouldn't allow him to leave.
Right. If after 2:10 p.m., what does the signal station say on Little Round Top at 2:10 p.m.? They have their ambulances with them too. 10,000. It's right there in the ORs at 1:40 p.m. It says 10,000 of the enemy are going from our left to our extreme right. Union cavalry rides to Hunterstown, attacks Confederate cavalry just coming through there from Carlisle, finds that they're not covering 10,000 Confederate infantry, but it sends them on Union cavalry on a wild goose chase north of here instead of coming over here. Once General Meade thinks the attack's going to be on his right, and that's where his logistics are, that means he's going to put the majority of his troops on the right, and Sickles can't move out to the orchard. There's no support. There's no support to move out to the orchard. There would have been, had Meade been here and there been an attack by the Union. But once Meade thinks the attack's going to come on his right, because of the signal station information, that the enemy's moving from our left to our extreme right, once that information comes in from the signal station and Meade goes to his right, Sickles doesn't have enough troops without Meade's help to advance to the peach orchard. If the attack's going to be on the right, over across the rail line and to the supply trains on the Baltimore Pike and Culp's Hill and Powers Hill, if the attack's going to be over there, then that's where the strength is going to be placed, which means Sickles can't move out to the orchard because he's not going to get any support. So he's told basically, he's not even told he has a position, he's just told to be out in front of the Round Tops. It's not even a clear position there with artillery support. When Sickles did advance, though, let me say this to you just to get you to think here. Had the attack on the right been real, General Meade was planning not to fall back to Pipe Creek, but to fall back to Little's Run at Two Taverns. Two Taverns is 5 miles south of Gettysburg. The reason why Buford was sent to Taneytown is that's where his left would have been. And his right would have been covering the Hanover-Gettysburg line and the Littlestown rail line. Why? Because the rail line had been repaired at this point, being repaired for almost 24 hours. Meade's not going to give up on that rail repair connection. So when Sickles said that had he not advanced to the orchard, that Meade planned to fall back, 2 other people said that. You know who else said that? Seth Williams. Seth Williams was close to Meade, loved Meade. He said under cross-examination to Congress, he said there was a contingency to fall back. Well, that's smart to have contingencies because you never know what's the uncertainty, fog of war. He also had an offensive plan at the same time. And he said, I saw it. Seth Williams told Congress, I saw it. He said, and then he said, I've looked in the records and it's not there. And he said, and it was never distributed. John Gibbon loved General Meade. He said the same thing under cross-examination with Congress. He said, I saw it, I looked at it. He said, I thought it strange at the time, but he said, I saw it. And he said, as I look at it and I think back on it now, he said, it wasn't a fall back to Pipe Creek. So it was somewhere between here and there. It's a defensive position to fall back to cover the wagon trains and to allow the rail line to continue to be repaired. With a Confederate attack coming on your right, you have to be ready for that, which means Sickles has limited numbers at the orchard. And therefore he can't advance to the orchard because he's not going to have any support to take up a longer line. So this is a moment in uncertainty in the battle on the second day between between 1:40 p.m. and 2:10 p.m. where Meade issues a contingency order, or has one written and it's not distributed. And the contingency is, if the attack shows up on the right, we have to fall back and cover the wagon trains. Not abandon Pennsylvania, but fall back on Littlestown. Why Littlestown? Littlestown is, you all know that Custer at the end of the second day of the battle, I don't know if you realize this or not, Judson Kilpatrick, which included Custer's brigade, his whole cavalry division under Judson Kilpatrick, and David Gregg's division. Did you know where both of those divisions were under the cover of darkness the night of July 2nd? Little's Run, 2 taverns. Now, why were they there? Because that's the natural fallback point. And then how did Custer get out to East Cavalry Field? He followed the route to Bonneville.